Hey everyone, and welcome to another Konoha Reviews. Today we talk about the old classic PlayStation 2 game, Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines, which was the official game entry for the film when it was released. It might come out of the blue for me reviewing a Terminator game, but with me recently on the main Konoha channel, having made some scenarios in ArmA 3 with the Terminator mod, I wanted to play some games in the Terminator universe. Now there aren't that many of them out there, and I know that the ones that do exist, especially the older ones, are notorious for receiving terrible scores and critiques. So I wanted to find out for myself if the games were indeed as bad as everyone said. Since my expectations were so incredibly low, I have to say that I was a little bit pleasantly surprised for the first 15 minutes or so. But as time progressed, my smile on my face faded into agony. Let's dive in. Movie franchise games aren't that common anymore nowadays, but back in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was pretty normal for games to accompany movies, and they were notorious for being bad, short, and rushed, since they had to adhere to the movie's release schedule. Often they would use film footage of the movie while it was still in cinema, and with some extra levels and minor stories, it could expand on the lore of the film. There were some studios that did try to make a decent game and put some effort into it, like the Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers game, which had solid mechanics and beautiful graphics for its time. But alas, it fell prey to the rushed syndrome, as the game could easily be completed in under 3 hours, earning the nickname Lord of the Rings: The 2 Hours. The short time span is also the case with Terminator 3. The game can be beaten in under 2 hours, with some levels and missions literally taking less than 2 minutes. But where I said that Lord of the Rings actually had very pretty graphics, that was not the case here. Terminator 3 is an ugly game to look at, through and through. But before that, I do have to praise its opening cutscene, as it's very cool, long, and action-packed. It reminded me of the early Capcom cutscenes for Resident Evil or Dino Crisis. It's very atmospheric and does get you in the mood for the setting. The Terminator's voice is also voiced by actual Arnold Schwarzenegger, though he doesn't sound like he's putting much effort into his line delivery. It's incredible, but he sounds even more like a robot than he does in the Terminator movies, and not in a good way. Anyway, the Terminator 3 game expands the lore in that the story starts off before the movie, as Arnie and the Resistance are heading to the Skynet facility to send Arnold back in time to save Connor and Brewster. This means that for the first hour, which is also the first half of the game, you will be fighting in the post-apocalyptic Los Angeles. So initially, when you start the game, you immediately notice that the game looks pretty ugly. Textures are muddy and blurry, character models look edgy, with stiff animations, and explosions look messy. But of course, the whole aesthetics of Terminator in the future is that everything is destroyed and dark, so it does adhere to the same aesthetic. Having 1 or 2 levels like this isn't too bad. But for having more than half of the game take place in this dark, grey, horrible looking environment, it really takes a toll on how fun it is to play, since every environment looks the same. When you do finally get some color introduced in the 2003 Los Angeles missions though, you can see even better how ugly the graphics actually are. But let's change to something positive, shall we? Because for the first 15 minutes or so, I actually was pretty entertained and pleasantly surprised with some stuff. First and foremost, I was surprised of how much of the environment you could blow up. As you fight through the bunkers, you notice that the concrete from pillars and walls blows up quite frequently, almost reminding you of the Matrix bank scene or a Red Faction game. I was surprised that they went through with the effort to make environments that destructible, especially for a console game where that was still quite new and revolutionary. Another cool little detail is that as you lose more health, Arnold's character will have more of his flesh torn off to reveal the Terminator metal skeleton underneath. This transfers to cutscenes too, to give it a nice little effort and detail and the extra step that the developers went through to deliver. Initially, the game also introduces you to multiple enemies from the Terminator universe, which is pretty cool at first, as the Terminator theme and sauce does save it a little bit from becoming boring. The models themselves of the enemy Terminators look awful though, but it's fun to also see the larger tanks and flying drones. But for the first hour, and thus half of the game, you will just be going through the same boring environments that are sometimes very difficult to traverse, as you can easily miss a door or opening in a wall since everything looks the same. The radar in the corner that shows you where you need to go is also awful and not helpful at all. At a certain point, you get to the Skynet facility, and then you finally have a change of color as a bit of brightness is introduced. Thank God. But all hallways in this facility look similar again, and the newly paint wears off after literally 3 minutes or so, as you still fight the same type of enemy over and over again. I will give it something for having a pretty decent amount of weapons you can use, including regular laser rifles, sniper rifles, grenades, shotguns, and rocket launchers. Some of these really break the game though, as a certain mini-boss gave me a lot of trouble with a certain weapon, whereas it died in 2 hits when I tried it with a different one. The turret sections are also strange, since they literally kill everything, even the huge hunter-killer tanks, with 1 hit, making it feel like they are made out of cardboard. During the first hour, you also get an encounter with a separate evil ArmA Terminator. This happens at the point where the game still didn't feel so boring, so it was a welcome surprise. The game actually shifts to a 3D fighter perspective whenever 2 Terminators fight in this game. And though I thought it was interesting at first, it's not all that special. The combos all look the same, and the only good thing I can say about these fights is that you can utilize some objects in the environment, and particular moves used by the enemies you face are literally used in the movies too. Once you reach halfway, you finally go back in time to 2003, and the game finally introduces some color since you are in Los Angeles. But then, of course, another 3D fighter sequence begins with your first fight against the female Terminator, and then the chase scene happens. Another fight. But all of a sudden, the 3D rendered cutscenes that are pretty good for such a crappy game get switched with actual footage from the movie. And not just small portions, but sometimes entire scenes that go on for minutes. Either they ran out of budgets to make more of those pre-rendered cutscenes, or they were obliged to use movie footage in this game somewhere. But it feels like such a drastic style change that it loses any believability, and it also jumps all over the place. For how boring the first hour is, you at least can follow the journey you make from the Resistance base all the way towards the chamber inside Skynet where you go back in time. Despite having watched the movie, the segments in 2003 LA jump so much that it doesn't feel like a coherent story anymore, but just a compilation of best moments from the film. There are also some really tedious missions here, where you need to bodyguard John Connor while avoiding to kill any incoming police. So you are stuck in an entire level just punching the same wooden NPCs over and over again. Then there's the weirdest level, where you are tasked with destroying police cars. And there's a lot of police cars. There's barely any resistance of enemies on this map, making it very boring. And despite finally having some bright colors in this level, it clearly shows you how ugly this game is. And honestly, the PlayStation 2 at that time was able to deliver far better graphics than this. It honestly reminds me of some of those re-releases of Sega Dreamcast games that they brought to the PlayStation 2 and GameCube. The only somewhat interesting twist there is in the game is that you go back to the future and see the perspective from an evil Terminator as it tries to kill John Connor. Now, all of the enemy Terminators are suddenly your allies and you are fighting the humans. It's a nice change of tone, but you are again fighting in the same boring grey streets. Ugh. The game ends again with a 3D rendered cutscene, and by the end, I was amazed of just how lackluster the game felt. It's definitely a bad game. It's too short, ugly, and the levels and action are monotone. Good things are the Terminator sauce, the amount of weapons, and small details like destructible environments. It's definitely the worst game I've reviewed yet on the channel, but it's difficult to give it a score since I have no other super bad games to compare it to. It's not a 2 or 3 score of a game, since again the action and some set pieces are cool thanks to it being Terminator. But it just needs more varied levels and action and be at least longer to up the score to at least a decent game. In the end, Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines gets a 5.4. Honestly, this score might be too high for it, but as I said, I don't have a bad game to compare it to yet. For now, this is the lowest score I have given a game on the channel, and I'm curious if in the future another title will claim that title from this. There's of course a lot of garbage out there if one looks for it. There's a few more Terminator games out there, and I might give them a chance someday to see how they stack up against this disappointing entry.